I'm going to give you a little bit of a homework assignment while those are being passed around. Just curious what you come up with. There's several things I come up with and did some studying, looked at different commentaries. But to be honest with you, what everybody said about this incident in the story today, I wasn't comfortable with their explanations. That's all I'm saying on that. It's just one of those things I looked at, so why did he do that? So if you got your handouts, you're going to come down to the 48th verse on the readings of Mark. And it says this, and I'm not going to mention much of this in the message today, but it's just one of those things that I'd like to know some more about it. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them, and about the fourth watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. And this next half a sentence is what I want you to look up, and just give me your take on it. Write a little paragraph on it. Tell me what you think, why he did this. He meant to pass by them. Why is that there? Why did he mean to pass by them? Now, he didn't, but he's walking on the scene. He meant to pass by him. Why? Like I said, there's several things out there, but I've not really been comfortable as far as saying, I can't really say for sure if I agree with that's what that means. So it's just a little homework assignment. I'm just interested in what your take is on that. And he meant to walk by them. So this morning, yes, Bob.
Paper I got starts out he sees. If anyone else has that, that's not correct. Paper is supposed to start out I am. And so there's more back there if you need
that may be the second, for whatever reason, it may have. Yeah, for whatever reason, that didn't get printed. That one there, Bob, the front didn't get typed, so I don't know if anybody else have a paper, both sides aren't filled out? Notes on both sides? Okay, just Bob. Okay. Again, a little homework assignment. We can get right into the message, and we're continuing our march kind of through the book of Mark. And the title of the messages this morning is I Am. And we start right out, he saw them. They were in the middle of a dark, stormy night. They were on the sea. Jesus, he's not with them. He's on the mountain. He's praying and having a conversation with his Father. Yet the Bible tells us that he saw them. Now, for me, and hopefully for you also, that's a great word of comfort here. For those of us who's going through one of the storms of life. And there's many storms of life that we face, some more severe than others. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, you're in either one of three places. And today that's true for you. You are either in a storm, or you're coming out of a storm, or you're heading into one. But you're one of three places. That's just how life is. There are physical storms. There are mental storms. There's emotional storms. There's spiritual storms. There's storms in the home. There's storms in our marriages. We can come into conflict and storms on our place of employment. And sad but true, there are times where there's storms in the church. There are storms that rage publicly, and there are storms that rage privately within our minds, within our heart, within our being. We struggle with things. Storms are part of the human existence. And this morning, I believe these verses offer some help and hope for those of us who's passing through a stormy time in our life. So we're going to read here in the book of Mark, chapter 6. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Now, those two verses are saying something we're going to get into here in just a little bit. All the things that Jesus had done to this point was a wow factor. In other words, it wowed the disciples. They were impressed. He was able to heal people. He drove out demons, raised the dead, calmed the storms, fed perhaps as many just here recently, just a few moments ago, a few hours ago, as many as 20,000 folks with a boy's lunch. They were impressed. But that's all. They were just impressed. They had not yet became convinced in who Jesus was. Because Mark says their hearts were hard. Now, this particular miracle, Matthew tells us, put them over the top. In other words, they finally get it. This guy is the Son of God, which means this is a very important story for us. Everything that transpired, they had never made that commitment before. The story begins with the familiar that we looked at last week. The only miracle to appear in all four Gospels. Jesus took the 5 loaves, he took the 2 fish, and he fed a multitude of folks with it. And it's great stuff. I mean, it's just like, in your mind, you just kind of picture this thing going about. I'm looking forward to heaven for a lot of different reasons. But down here, we have what we call home movies. And every once in a while, when all the family's over, we break out the home movies and we watch them. And so, look how little you was. Look how much hair you had and all that kind of stuff, you know. And that's our technology. God has got technology that is through the roof, if you want to accept that saying. And I believe that when we get to heaven, this is my opinion here, I believe that we're going to be able to say, I want to see the walking on the sea. I want to see it. So we'll be there, and I think we'll be able to see it. I think it'll be played back to us. I just believe that. And I'm looking forward because there's a lot of things in my mind. I picture it, but I really want to see the greatest show on earth. I want to see it. And I believe one day I'll have the ability to do that. So here we have, and like I said, just great stuff. Jesus and disciples, they're now here in the middle of nowhere. And the crowd is there, and he makes them sit down by 50s and 100s, and he blesses some bread, and he blesses some fish. And he feeds every one of them until they're completely satisfied. Not only that, but they took up 12 baskets of leftovers. I think that's significant. In my mind, the scriptures don't say this, but in my mind, the disciples went out and gathered the leftovers. The Bible said there was 12 baskets full, and I believe each disciple had a basket. And maybe it started with Andrew because he's the one that brought the little fish and the loaves to Jesus' attention. And Andrew's looking in this basket completely full. And he looks down the line, and all 12 disciples have got a basket, and it's completely full. I think that's an amazing point. Jesus, at that point, I believe, has their attention. And so we read these words in John 6:15. I'm not where I need to be on this. Did I have it up? There it is. Okay. We don't have the projector running in the back, and she's put this up. I didn't really turn around and look, but it's a little bit, it's not back here. There's it. Oh, I see it. She's got two pictures here. I apologize. I'm one of those guys, I like things to be the same. So we read here in John 6:15, so Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force. Now, this isn't in Mark, but it's one of the witnesses that John finds in his narrative, and perceiving they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself to be alone. Now, the crowds that day were going to forcefully make him king. There's quite a few folks there, 20,000 people. If it's upwards, that's a lot of people. Arlen Field will hold about 10,000 people, and I've been there when it's been packed. And a lot of people. So here we have upwards to 20,000 people, and they're wanting to make him king. And the only reason they ate a good lunch. It's kind of crazy. It was better than Golden Corral. They were fickle, easily satisfied, wrongly motivated. Just a group of people that wanted to make him king because of the miracle of the fish and the loaves. Which brings us to part of our text. And he says, get in the boat. Get in the boat. Now, to look the words up, there was Christ was upset. He was forceful. And the word means Jesus constrained his men to get in the ship and go across the sea. The word constrained is a very strong word. It means to drive or to force. Christ is saying, get in the boat. He commanded them, he compelled them to get in the boat. Why? Well, there's a lot of hoopla going on. No doubt the disciples, they're right there in the middle of it. And can you imagine their response? Finally, after 2 years of walking around, no place to lay their head, living from hand to mouth, this is it. This is it, Jesus. That's what they're saying. This is it. They're ready to make you king. You have them eating out of your hands, literally. Let's go. We'll march with these tens of thousands to Jerusalem. We'll pick up a few more thousand on the way. We'll get rid of Herod and we'll take on Rome. Jesus, this is it. It's time to claim your kingdom. Get in the boat. He wasn't going to be satisfied. It upset Christ. Now, the question is, did he not know the storm was coming because he was angry? I'm sure he knew the storm was coming. Truth is that God stands behind all the storms of our lives. Some people, some theology has a problem with that truth. But to me and to you, it ought to give us great comfort. It's just one area of our lives. If just one area of our lives was outside his control today, then you and I would be in serious trouble. If Satan, the world, or this flesh can disrupt our life, I'm talking about a Christian, can disrupt our life apart from the permission of God, then no area of our life is safe. However, if God is in control, and I believe he is, I believe he's sovereign, then whatever he allows into your life or mine will always work out for our good and his glory. Even though we may cause some of the storms because of our attitude, because of our decisions, but because of our choices, God is still in control. And God has great mercy. You can go so far with God, and God will say, okay, I'm going to let you believe that depravity, and you've made your own bed. I don't know where that point is, neither do you. But I'm glad this morning that God is in control. He tells us in the book of Romans, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Now, the challenge there is loving God. Remember the question the Lord asked? Why do you say that you love me? Why do you say that you love me and you don't take my prescriptions and you don't follow my commands? But for those who love God, all things work together for good. So there's a challenge there. Satan tried to do this once before. To set up a kingdom and bypass the cross was exactly what Satan had attempted to do with Jesus back in the wilderness. This was not the way it was planned from the foundations of the world. You come into the kingdom through the cross or you don't come at all. That was the plan. And it's easy to see how Christ was fighting again the adversary. See, the adversary, just because you defeat him once, doesn't mean he's going to come back. It doesn't mean he won't come back again, because he does. And we find Satan now working through a miracle that Christ had done through thousands of people to set his kingdom up. He'd already told Satan, no, that's not how we do this. So he's continuing to do battle with the forces of darkness, and so will you. You come into the kingdom through the cross, or you just don't come. So he's dismissing the crowds, and now Jesus is up on the mountaintop, and he's beginning to pray. That's the scene. It's evening. It's getting dark. The crowds are gone. Jesus is praying. And the disciples are supposed to be making their way across the northern part of the Sea of Galilee toward Bethsaida. But they encounter a storm. It's not just any storm. It's a doozy of a storm. It's kind of like a storm that kind of gets you afraid right off the bat. Storms have the potential to stop progress and to send you the wrong way. The boat was being battered by the waves. Literally, it was being hammered. The wind was against them. They were going into a headwind that was driving them the wrong way. They were going backwards more than they were going forward. Mark tells us they were straining at the oars. In other words, they were straining to get past the headwind. But it was much too much. You have the disciples literally fighting for their lives. And they'd been doing it all night. When Jesus finally shows up, it's during the fourth watch of the night. That's the Roman way of dividing the night up into different periods. The fourth watch was from about 3 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock in the morning. And the point is this: the disciples had been fighting the storm all night, up to 6 hours. And they were no closer to their destination than when they started. Some folks, and I'll just throw it in here because I'm not going to mention it more in the message. Some folks feel that another miracle happened, that when Christ got in the boat, immediately they was at their destination. I'm not for sure if I believe that. The words don't say that, but there's some commentators will say that was a miracle, that immediately it was there. And they kind of hook it in with that he would have walked on by, but you'll see that if you do your homework. Now, we want to kind of camp out here for just a moment, because it was Jesus who sent these disciples away in the boat. Very emphatically, he sent them away. Either Jesus didn't know what would happen, which to me is unacceptable, or Jesus made a mistake, which again to me is very unacceptable, or he sent them into the storm on purpose. And I believe Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. Some think when you come to faith in Christ, it's all prosperity for you. You can name it and claim it. Your struggles and your trials go away. But see, God sometimes allows storms into our lives to mature us and to teach us. To teach us about himself. To teach us about our relationship with him. And I believe that's what he's doing here. Jesus could have prevented the storm. He could have come to them sooner if he'd wanted to. But he allowed them to reach the edge of their need before he intervened. And sometimes he does that. But when those times come, we can be sure he knows where we are. He knows exactly what's going on. and He knows what we need. And above all else, He knows what He's doing. Did you ever have a moment when you was a child and your mother and father was doing something, you stood back and said, I don't think that's going to work. I don't think He knows what He's doing. And there was times they didn't. But we can't say that about God. God knows exactly what He's doing. The way the Lord values His relationship with us cannot be fully appreciated until we realize how incredibly invested our God is in keeping His promises to us. I mean, we can hang our hat on that. The reality is we just don't know how things are going to play out. And it's the not knowing that crushes us. I don't know about you, but I suspect you're a lot like I am. But just a few moments of sheer unknowing can take Kevin right to the edge. The concerns and questions, they come fast and furious. What's up ahead? How will I ever get through this? Am I going to lose it? Am I going to lose it all? Will I be able to endure? Will I ever be okay again? Well, God's promises are the assurances He gives His people so that we can walk by faith while we wait for Him to work. Today, I believe. Tomorrow, or at some time in the future, I receive. The distance between today and tomorrow is walking by faith. There's a 10-pound gold nugget there. You've got the promise. You're going to receive. But between the promise and the reception, you got to walk by faith. I believe God asks you and I to hang on to our assurances of determined outcomes to get through the dark and the difficult times when life is hard. That's why He gave us His promises, to get us through the difficult days of waiting. Now, I don't think there's anything any more difficult than losing a loved one, a child, a parent, a spouse. But His promise tells us that that's not the final resting place. That's a promise. One day we'll receive that. Until we receive that, we're walking by faith. Now, we're coming upon our first miracle here in this message this morning, and that's where Jesus came walking to them on the water. Waves are crashing. Sea spray is everywhere. The wind's howling. The night is dark. There's no moonlight, no starlight. Occasional flashes of lightning that illuminates the sky. Perhaps claps of thunder. Then they look out and they see a figure walking towards them. And their response, any way you want to look at these words, is simply sheer terror. I don't know if I've ever experienced sheer terror. I mean, where I've been completely and totally in terror. But these disciples were when they seen what they called a ghost or a phantom walking in the middle of a storm-thrashed sea. They cry out. And you look at that word, and it means they scream. We have grown men screaming like little girls. Now, I'm not saying anything bad about little girls, but I'm saying they're screaming like little girls. Grown men. They're terrified. Their hopelessness, if it could get any worse, did. Their hopelessness now turned to horror. They were terrified. So this is a beautiful spot right here. Jesus calls out to them, take heart. Literally, cheer up. And I know He didn't just say it in a nice, pleasant way. He had to tell them in a voice that was probably supernaturally magnified past the storm and the waves and the crashing. But they heard Him say, take heart. Do not be afraid. And sandwiched between those encouragements is the reason they can cheer up. The reason they need not fear. And it's three little words called, it is I. Now, this is significant. Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid. The Greek words are ego eimi. And literally it's translated, I am. The same word used in the Greek translation of the Hebrew language in the Old Testament in Exodus 3 when God appeared to Moses in the burning bush. Moses asked his name. My name is ego eimi. I am. Then John 8 uses Jesus. He claims to exist before Abraham. Remember that? Where before Abraham was, I am. That's when they wanted to stone him. They wanted to get rid of him because they knew what he was saying. They knew he was taking on the title of God. Before Abraham was, I am. Well, don't you mean before Abraham I was? No. I'm ego eimi. Mark intends for you and I to understand the reason they need not fear in the midst of a storm is because the God of the universe was there. I am. Christ is now knocking their socks off. He is going beyond the wow factor. He is going into the realm of convincing them of who he is. Not only does Christ see them, but he also sees us. And even though he was on the mountaintop and he seen them, he was just as present with them as he had already been in the boat. And just as he is in heaven making intercessions to God on our behalf, he is present with us. I don't know what storms you're facing, but I want to remind you that the great I am promised to never leave you, to never forsake you. He is present. He knows what you need. He knows where you are. While he was praying on the mountaintop, I believe he could have very well been praying for the disciples. Because in the book of Romans, it says he's seated at the right hand of God, interceding for us. I think that's who he is. That's his character. That's part of God's love for you and I. Part of the Son's love for you and I. How the Son and the Father and the Holy Spirit work together for our best interest. Not for our best wants, but for our best interest. Which means, in spite of whatever storm you're going through, you'll never find yourself in a place where Jesus can't find you. Isn't that just great? I mean, there's been times I thought that he was just as far away from me as anything could be. But he wasn't. At that time, I didn't realize it, but he was probably closer to me than he ever had been. We'll never be to the place where Christ can't find us. You'll never be in a storm so severe, the night never so black, the boat never so frail, that we must be fearful or discouraged that we're beyond his care. Remember, he's seated at the right hand of God, making intercessions for us in our most darkest time. So first, we had the miracle of Jesus walking on the water. Second, we now have the miracle of Peter walking on the water. Most of us have heard this story. We're very familiar with it. We know all about Peter's successful and his failed attempt to walk on the water. Now, only Matthew records this. I find this fascinating. You won't find it in Mark, Luke, or John. Only Matthew talks about Peter walking on the water. When Jesus calls out to the disciples, Peter responds. Don't be afraid, it is I. Be of good cheer. And then Peter says, if it's you, command me to come to you. I love how Christ just doesn't make a lot of wordy responses. He just said, come. Just one little 4-letter word. He said, come. And the amazing thing here, that Peter went from screaming like a little child to getting out of the boat pulling away from the structure and committing himself to the storm, committing himself to the sea. That's what we see. But for one moment, whatever transpired in Peter's mind, in his life, he was not committing himself to the sea or to the storm. He was committing himself to Jesus. At that moment, when Christ spoke, I am, Peter believed. And he committed himself to Christ, not anything else. But at that moment, he committed himself to Christ. You and I need to learn that when we get into a storm, and we're going to, and some of them's going to be doozies, we need to just commit ourselves to Christ. To Christ. To Christ. Come. We're not sure how far Peter walked, but apparently he walked most of the way. Because when he started to sink, he was close enough to Jesus that Jesus simply reached out his hand and grabbed him. Then they both walked on the water back to the boat. I can't imagine Jesus walking back to the boat and Peter swimming alongside. I believe they both walked back to the boat. You see, when Peter got out there for just a moment, he took his eyes off of Jesus and began to look around. He saw the wind and he saw the waves, and the storm was still there. And Peter reverted back to being frightened once again, and he began to sink. And you and I think we do the same thing. We can face storms in our lives, significant storms of huge proportions. And we can have encouragement, say, this is a good day. I thank you, Lord. And then the next day we find ourselves frightened again. But as long as we look to Jesus and his promises, we're assured that all will be well. Because the I am is with us. The storm is still there, but he helps us through. Let's not take our eyes off of Christ. Let's not look at our circumstances and begin to doubt. Because when we do, we sink in the sea of despondency and despair. Jesus said, I am true to my word. I am true to my word. I'll see you through. I won't necessarily cease the raging of the storm or the circumstances of life that you're going through, but I will see you through. I will. This is kind of fascinating if we can get our mind wrapped around it. He won't cease the storm of the circumstances. He will see us through and cease the storm in our heart and in our mind. We have this huge assurance, and it's a reminder from our apostle, Paul. He says, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? That's pretty cool. Even when it's hard to trust, God's promises remain the same. Nothing can change God's stated intent. You have to believe with everything in you that he's got your best interest at heart. He'll graciously give you what you need for the moment or the storm at hand. Jesus said to Peter, oh, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? You almost made it. Just a few more steps and you were right here. Don't doubt, don't trust, but trust. I'm confident Peter took this event, as they say, I believe Peter took this event to the grave with him. I mean, he walked on water. He's the only person on the planet besides Jesus to walk on water. Now, even though he sank, I don't look at that part of it. I get encouragement. When I look at Peter walking on the water, he is an encouragement to me to exercise faith and walk with Jesus through the storms. Regardless whether I have a boat or not, I can walk with Jesus through the storms. Peter's a great encouragement to me. I want to get to the place where I can look at Christ as being the Messiah and nothing else matters. I don't need to boat. I don't need to fear. I don't need to be frightened. I don't need to be terrified. I can walk through the storms of life with Jesus. Come. The Bible says in verse 51, then he got into the boat with them and the wind stopped. The storm died. And again, that's an encouragement to you and I. The encouragement is that storms don't last forever. As I said, Jesus fed perhaps as many as 20,000 folks with a boy's lunch. They were impressed, but it hadn't convinced them. They didn't get it. Which I believe is exactly why we have the story of Jesus walking on the water and telling him in the very midst of the storm, I am. It's almost like Jesus is talking to his Father on the mountain. He says, okay, fine. Let's throw them into the midst of another storm where they fight for their lives all night. Then I'll take a little stroll in the middle of the night on top of the water. Let's see if they can figure it out then. As we kind of wrap the message up this morning, in a lot of ways we can identify with the disciples. The disciples were blind to the power and the person of the Lord Jesus. And I think we have a majority of the church today, I'm talking about the church, that they are literally blind to the power and the person of the Lord Jesus. And I know what the problem is. I've talked to several people about it many times. It's just not real to us. The problem is that, like those disciples, we have a small faith because we don't understand just how big God is. In spite of the wonderful word, in spite of many things that we've seen, we just don't get it. Because of our small view, we often miss out on the big things the Lord wants to do in our lives, in our church, and for our community. Our lack of faith can limit God's power to work in our midst. In the book of Mark, earlier we went through this, and you'll recall it, and he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. Bob, I don't want God to marvel at our unbelief. I don't want that, but sometimes I believe that we find ourselves in that position. And he tells us I couldn't do much there because they just didn't believe. I laid my hands on a few sick folk, and that was about it. I believe when we're walking with God, with Christ, being led by the Holy Spirit, by faith, as we ought to be, he is able to use us in a very great way. And when I say it becomes a great way, it becomes like this. Look what God is doing. It's not like, look what that church is doing, look what pastor is doing, look what so-and-so, sister, brother. But no, it's like, look what God is doing. Because it's bigger than us. It's greater than we are. We're just being obedient when he says to come through the storm. We don't look at all the stuff that's going on in our culture. We just go to Jesus. Jesus has got a purpose. He's got a plan. He's got something he wants us engaged with. Let's determine that we will be a people at liberty that he can use for his glory. That we can have a big God who moves in big ways. We don't want to have a little God who rarely shows up and never shows out. And you and I, we need to decide on a regular basis, day to day, month to month, year to year, what we want for our community of Northern Richland County. Just because you have a success today and next week doesn't mean that success is going to continue unless you believe that you serve a big God who wants to show up in a big way. And we walk by faith. We don't cross all the T's. We don't dot all the I's. We don't wait till we have the means in our perspective, because we already have the means from a God who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, the 1,000 hills, the cattle. He owns it all. That's a Hudson Taylor. He took that literally and did a massive movement in China because he believed God owned all of it. He owned nothing. He just managed the resources God placed in his ministry. He believed that he served a big God that could show up in a big way. And we can do the same thing here in our community of North Emerson County. Matthew, he records this: when Jesus got into the boat, immediately they exclaimed, "You are certainly God's Son." First time in the Gospels, the disciples declare it. They declare it because they finally got it. And that's the message Jesus wants you to hear today. He is the Son of God. In fact, he is God himself. He's the great I am of the burning bush. He wants to show himself mighty in our presence. In the storms of life, in the challenges we face, I believe Christ wants to pass by you and I. I believe he wants to say to us, cheer up. Don't be afraid. I am that I am is here. And somewhere that passing by, I think, fits in with that, but I'm not for sure how. You may have an insight on that. Maybe God will open your hearts to something there. We're going to ask you to stand. I took a lot of encouragement from my own personal walk this week in putting that message together for you folks.